This is probably the most action-packed story I have ever read. Bartleby, the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street by Herman Melville. I am a rather elderly man. The nature of my avocations for the last 30 years has brought me into more than ordinary contact with what would seem an interesting and somewhat singular set of men, of whom as yet nothing that I know of has ever been written. I mean the law copyists and scriveners. I have known very many of them, professionally and privately, and if I pleased, could relate divers histories at which good-natured gentlemen might smile and sentimental souls might weep. But I waive the biographies of all other scriveners for a few passages in the life of Bartleby, who was a scrivener of the strangest I ever saw or heard of. While of other law copyists I might write the complete life, of Bartleby nothing of that sort can be done. I believe that no materials exist for a full and satisfactory biography of this man. It is an irreparable loss to literature. Bartleby was one of those beings of whom nothing is ascertainable except from the original sources, and in his case, those are very small. What my own astonished eyes saw of Bartleby, that is all I know of him, except indeed one vague report which will appear in the sequel. Ere introducing the Scrivener, as he first appeared to me, it is fit I make some mention of myself, my employees, my business, my chambers, and general surroundings, because some such description is indispensable to an adequate understanding of the chief character about to be presented. Imprimis. I am a man who, from his youth upwards, has been filled with a profound conviction that the easiest way of life is the best. Hence, though I belong to a profession proverbially energetic and nervous, even a turbulence at times, yet nothing of that sort have I ever suffered to invade my peace. I am one of those unambitious lawyers who never addresses a jury or in any way draws business among rich men's bonds and mortgages and title deeds. Or in a way draws down public applause, but in the cool tranquility of a snug retreat do a snug business among rich men's bonds and mortgages and title deeds. All who know me consider me an eminently safe man. The late John Jacob Astor, a personage little given to poetic enthusiasm, had no hesitation in pronouncing my first grand point to be prudence, my next, method. I do not speak it in vanity, but simply record the fact that I was not unemployed in my profession by the late John Jacob Astor, a name which I admit I love to repeat, for it hath a rounded and orbicular sound to it, and rings like unto bullion. I will freely add that I was not insensible to the late John Jacob Astor's good opinion. Sometime prior to the period at which this little history begins, my avocations had been largely increased. The good old office, now extinct in the state of New York, of a master in chancery court, had been conferred upon me. It was not a very arduous office, but very pleasantly remunerative. Remunerative. I seldom lose my temper, much more seldom indulge in dangerous indignation at wrongs and outrages. But I must be permitted to be rash here and declare that I consider the sudden and violent abrogation of the office of Master in Chancery by the new Constitution as a premature act, inasmuch as I had counted upon a life lease of the profits, whereas I only received those of a few short years. But this is by the way. My chambers were upstairs at number blank Wall Street. At one end, they looked upon the white wall of the interior of a spacious skylight shaft, penetrating the building from top to bottom. This view might have been considered rather tame than otherwise, deficient in what landscape painters call, quote-unquote, life. But if so, the view from the other end of my chambers offered, at least, a contrast, if nothing more. In that direction, my windows commanded an unobstructed view of a lofty brick wall, black by age and everlasting shade, which wall required no spyglass to bring out its lurking beauties, but for the benefit of all near-sighted spectators, was pushed up to within 10 feet of my window panes. Owing to the great height of the surrounding buildings, and my chambers being on the second floor, the interval between this wall and mine not a little resembled a huge square cistern. At the period just preceding the advent of Bartleby, I had two persons as copyists in my employment, and a promising lad as an office boy. First, Turkey. Second, Nippers. Third, Ginger Nut. These may seem names, the like of which are not usually found in the directory. In trust, they were nicknames, mutually conferred upon each other by my three clerks, and were deemed expressive of their respective present persons or characters. Turkey was a short, pursy Englishman of about my own age, that is, somewhere not far from 60. In the morning, one might say, his face was of a fine florid hue. But after 12 o'clock, meridian, his dinner hour, it blazed like a grate full of Christmas coals, and continued blazing, but as it were, with a gradual wane, till 6 o'clock p.m., or thereabouts, after which I saw no more of the proprietor of the face, which gained its meridian with the sun, seemed to set with it, to rise, culminate, and decline the following day with the like regularity and undiminished glory. There are many singular coincidences I have known in the course of my life, not the least among which was the fact that exactly when Turkey displayed his fullest beams from his red and radiant countenance, just then, too, at that critical moment, began the daily period when I considered his business capacities as seriously disturbed for the remainder of the 24 hours. Not that he was absolutely idle or averse to business then. Far from it. The difficulty was, he was apt to be altogether too energetic. There was a strange, inflamed, flurried, flighty recklessness of activity about him. He would be incautious in dipping his pen into his inkstand. All his blots upon my documents were dropped there after 12 o'clock, meridian. Indeed, Not only would he be reckless and sadly given to be making blots in the afternoon, but some days he went further and was rather noisy. At such times, too, his face flamed with augmented blazonry, as if canned coal had been heaped on anthracite. He made an unpleasant racket with his chair, spilled his sandbox, and mending his pens, impatiently split them all to pieces and threw them on the turn the page. Threw them on the floor in a sudden passion, stood up and leaned over his table, boxing his papers about in a most indecorous manner. Very sad to behold in an elderly man like him. Nevertheless, as he was in many ways the most valuable person to me, and all the time before 12 o'clock, meridian, was the quickest, steadiest creature too, accomplishing a great deal of work in a style not easy to be matched. For these reasons, I was willing to overlook his eccentricities, though indeed, occasionally, I remonstrated with him. I did this very gently, however, because though the civilest, nay, the blandest and most reverential of men in the morning, yet in the afternoon he was disposed, upon provocation, to be slightly rash with his tongue, in fact, insolent. Now, valuing his morning services as I did, and resolved not to lose them, yet at the same time made uncomfortable by his inflamed ways after 12 o'clock, and being a man of peace, unwilling by my admonitions to call forth unseemly retorts from him, I took upon me, one Saturday noon, he was always worse on Saturdays, to hint to him very kindly that perhaps now that he was growing old, it might be well to abridge his labors. In short, he need not come to my chambers after 12 o'clock, but dinner over, had best go home to his lodgings and rest himself till tea time. But no. He insisted upon his afternoon devotions. His countenance became intolerably fervid as he oratorically assured me, gesticulating with a long ruler at the other end of the room, that if his services in the morning were useful, how indispensable then in the afternoon. With submission, sir, said Turkey on this occasion, I consider myself your right-hand man. In the morning, I but marshal and deploy my columns, but in the afternoon, I put myself at their head and gallantly charge the foe thus. And he made a violent thrust with the ruler. But the blots, Turkey, intimated I. True. But with submission, sir, behold these hairs. I am getting old. Surely, sir, a blot or two of a warm afternoon is not to be severely urged against gray hairs. Old age, even if it blot the page, is honorable. With submission, sir, we both are getting old. This appeal to my fellow feeling was hardly to be resisted. At all events, I saw that go he would not. So I made up my mind to let him stay, resolving, nevertheless, to see to it that during the afternoon he had to do with my less important papers. Nippers, the second on my list, was a whiskered, sallow, and upon the whole rather piratical-looking young man of about 25. I always deemed him the victim of two evil powers, ambition and indigestion. The ambition was evinced by a certain impatience of the duties of a mere copyist. an unwarrantable usurpation of strictly professional affairs, such as the original drawing up of legal documents. The indigestion seemed betokened in an occasion nervous testiness and grinding irritability, causing the teeth to audibly grind together over mistakes committed in copying, unnecessary maledictions hissed rather than spoken in the heat of business, and especially by a continual discontent with the height of the table where he worked. Though of a very ingenious mechanical turn, Nippers could never get the table to suit him. He put chips under it, blocks of various sorts, bits of paste wood, and at last went so far as to attempt an exquisite adjustment by final pieces of folded blotting paper. But no invention would answer. If for the sake of easing his back, he brought the table lid at a sharp angle well up towards his chin, and wrote there like a man using the steep roof of a Dutch house for his desk. Then he declared that it stopped the circulation in his arms. If now he lowered the table in his waistbands and stooped over it in writing, then there was a sore aching in his back. In short, the truth of the matter was, Nippers knew not what he wanted, or, if he wanted anything, it was to be rid of the Scrivener's table altogether. Among the manifestations of his diseased ambition was a fondness he had for receiving visits from certain ambiguous-looking fellows in seedy coats, whom he called his clients. Indeed, I was aware that not only was he, at times, considerable of a ward politician, but he occasionally did a little business at the justices' courts. It was not unknown on the steps of the tombs. I have good reason to believe, however, that one individual who called upon him at my chambers, and who, with a good air, he insisted was his client, was no other than a dun, and the alleged title deed a bill. But with all his failings and the annoyances he caused me, Nippers, like his compatriot Turkey, was a very useful man to me, wrote a neat, swift hand, and when he chose, was not deficient in a gentlemanly sort of deportment. Added to this, he always dressed in a gentlemanly sort of way, and so instantly reflected credit upon my chambers. Whereas with Turkey, I had much ado to keep him from being a reproach to me. His clothes were apt to look oily and smell of eating houses. He wore his pantaloons very loose and baggy in summer. His coats were execrable, his hat not to be handled. But while the hat was a thing of indifference to me, inasmuch as his natural civility and deference, as a dependent Englishman, always led him to doff it the moment he entered the room, yet his coat was another matter. Concerning his coats, I reasoned with him, but with no effect. The truth was, I suppose, that a man of so small an income could not afford to sport such a lustrous face and a lustrous coat at one and the same time. As Nippers once observed, Turkey's money went chiefly for red ink. One winter day, I presented Turkey with a highly respectable-looking coat of my own, a padded gray coat of a most comfortable warmth, and which buttoned straight up from his knee to the neck. I thought Turkey would appreciate the favor, and share his rashness and his obstreperousness of afternoons. But no. I verily believed that buttoning himself up in so downy and blanket like a coat had a pernicious effect upon him, upon the same principles that too much oats are bad for horses. What? Sorry, turn the page. In fact, precisely as a restive horse is said to feel his oats, so Turkey felt his coat. It made him insolent. He was a man whom prosperity harmed. Though concerning the self-indulgent habits of Turkey, I had my own private surmises. Yet touching Nippers, I was well persuaded that whatever might be his faults in other respects, he was, at least, a temperate young man. But indeed, nature herself seemed to have been his vintner, and that his birth charged him so thoroughly with an irritable, brandy-like disposition that all subsequent potations were needless. When I consider how, amid the stillness of my chambers, Nippers would sometimes impatiently rise from his seat, and stooping over his table, spread his arms wide apart, seize the whole desk, and move it and jerk it with a grinding motion on the floor, as if the table were a perverse voluntary agent intent on thwarting and vexing him, I plainly perceived that for Nippers, brandy and wine were altogether superfluous. It was fortunate for me that, owing to my peculiar cause, indigestion, the irritability and consequent nervousness of Nippers were mainly observable in the morning, while in the afternoon he was comparatively mild, so that Turkey's paroxysms only coming on about 12 o'clock, I never had to do with her eccentricities at the same time. Their fits relieved each other like guards. When Nippers was on, Turkey's was off, and vice versa. This was a good natural arrangement under the circumstances. Ginger Nut, the third on my list, was a lad some 12 years old. His father was a carman, ambitious of seeing his son on the bench instead of a cart before he died. So he sent him to my office as student at law, errand boy, and cleaner and sweeper at the rate of $1 a week. He had a little desk to himself, but he did not use it much. Upon inspection, the dresser exhibited a great array of the shells of various sorts of nuts. Indeed, to this quick-witted youth, the whole noble science of the law was contained in a nutshell. Side note, there's a series of law treatises, the nutshells, Back to it. Not the least among the employment of Ginger Nut, as well as one which he discharged with the most alacrity, was his duty as cake and apple purveyor for Turkey and Nippers. Copying law papers being proverbially dry, husky sort of business, my two Scriveners were fain to moisten their mouths very often with Spitzenbergs to be had at the numerous stalls nigh the customs house and post office. Also, they sent Ginger Nut very frequently for that peculiar cake, small, flat, round, and very spicy, after which he had been named by them. Of a cold morning, when business was but dull, Turkey would gobble up scores of these cakes, as if they were mere wafers. Indeed, they sell them at the rate of 6 or 8 for a penny, the scrape of his pen blending with the crunching of the crisp particles in his mouth. Of all the fiery afternoon blunders and flurried rashnesses of Turkey, was his once moistening a ginger cake between his lips and clapping it on a mortgage for a seal. I came within an ace of dismissing him then, but he mollified me by making an oriental bow and saying, with submission, "Sir, It was generous of me to find you in stationery on my account, on my original business. That all of a conveyancer and title hunter, and drawer up of recondite documents of all sorts, I know what he's talking about, was considerably increased by receiving the master's office. There was now great work for scriveners. Not only must I push the clerks already with me, but I must have additional help. In answer to my advertisement, a motionless young man one morning stood upon my office threshold, the door being open, for it was summer. I can see that figure now, pallidly neat, pitiably respectable, incurably forlorn. It was Bartleby.